ZERGLING Hunter is a deck that was introduced in the Great Dark Beyond mini set. The idea behind the deck is you want to buff your Zergling to become really strong in the early turns. The cards that you want to mulligan for is Spawning Pool, Tracking, and Reserve Spot. And the idea behind the deck is you want to be able to get your minions out really early and really quickly. The spawning pool generally you want to have down first, because if you have spawning pool down on turn 1, you will be able to get the activator on turn 3 to have it down. Cup of Muscle obviously is quite strong if you do have the spawning pool ready too. So in the gameplay footage, you'll notice that I have the spawning pool and reserve spot, which does show that it's going to be a significantly strong combo. Something that you do also need to think about is when you use your bird watching to use your spawning pool activator beforehand. I think is a game or two that I do use the spawning pool after using the bird watching, which obviously is a little bit of a mistake. Going into this footage, you'll see that I just got a Zergling out of my first turn. Next turn, provided that I don't end up drawing it into a minion, I'll be able to get the reserve spot on turn 2 with 2 5/5s, which is exceptionally strong for an opponent to be trying to deal with in the early game. So I end up using the coin here. I use reserve spot since it's my only minion in my hand, and then I just pass my turn over to the opponent. So that does mean that they don't have a particular way to be able to deal with me very easily, having 2 5/5s on the board. Next turn, I'll be able to use the spawning proc a second time, and then also use my Zerg spell that gives the Zerglings +2/+1, which obviously is going to be pretty overwhelming for the opponent. I do end up drawing into Cup of Muscle, which is obviously quite strong in this situation as well. So I played out my Zergling. I could have used Cup of Muscle in this situation too, or I could use the the evolution thing from the card, but ultimately just getting the 2 5/3 is obviously going to be better than getting a 3/2 down on the board, so it means that I can trade into the 2/2 while also going face. And that game was over exceptionally quick, which is the power behind this deck if you do draw into the cards that you need. So once again, going into this game that I'm playing, I open with the spawning pool in my opening hand. So if I had reserve spot or cup of muscle, this would obviously be a very strong hand. I do end up getting the second spawning pool as well, which is quite good for me. So this turn I draw into my reserve spot as well, which is quite lucky for me. I use a spawning pool proc, and then I pass over to my opponent. Next turn, I'm going to be playing down the second spawning pool and also that Zergling that's there, just because it means that I can get some tempo down onto the board onto the opponent. So I play the spawning pool, I play my first Zergling down. Obviously next turn I'll be using the reserve spot to be able to get a strong boost off for the next turn. Just make sure that if you are going for this particular strategy, you don't pop the second spawning pool in this situation, so you don't lose the cost reduction that can come from this card. They end up using their spawning pool, so it obviously gets a minion onto the board for them. It gets this location on the board for them, and I'm just going face with this damage that's here. There's no point to proc my spawning pool just because I don't have a particular play to do this next turn, that turn, because there's no point using the rush proc for it. They end up using Domino Effect, which does clear most of my minions, so I just have the 5/1 that's left, which is a little bit difficult, so I end up just playing down my Titanforge traps. Obviously it applies a little bit of pressure towards my opponent, and ultimately just helps me with choosing what sort of strategy I'm going to go for. I end up getting the Hidden Meaning, which is quite strong, especially in the early game against specific decks. I also do have the Char in my hand as well, which will be quite strong to boost up my Zergling for next turn, and I will have Rush on it for next turn as well because of the spawning pool activator. So I end up having the 5/1 that's here as well, so I do obviously have the Char that's in my hand as too. So what I want to do is I want to trade the 5/1 into that 4/1, so it ends up getting a +6/6 boost to my Zergling, and then obviously I do activate the spawning pool so I can trade into their 4/6. This does create quite a strong board for me. Going into the opponent's next turn. Since they are playing the Giants list, and they don't have any Giants down the board, it does mean that I have quite a strong board to be able to deal with what they have coming towards me. They end up playing down all their Zerglings, so obviously with the bait and switch, it does make me out of range for those particular minions to be able to take me out. So they end up just trading into my guy. They use their soul searching, which won't particularly do too much since I do have obviously quite a decent sized board now, especially since I got the bait and switch proc. And I end up just using the Char here. It obviously gets me a bigger board for my opponent to have to deal with an extra 2/7/7s, and then I just go face with my two other minions that are here as well. There's no point playing down that 1/1 that's in my hand, just in case they do have some sort of way to deal with me, especially since I do have quite a strong hand that's here. So as you can see, it does have a lot of power into particular matchups, especially if you do get the spawning pool and reserve spot opening hand. It's sometimes very hard for even control decks to be able to deal with. So going into this matchup, I am playing against a warrior. So it's important against a warrior that you're not going too wide against them, and you also are applying the different tempo and different aggression towards them. I do have the Zergling in my hand with a Cup of Muscle. That's the reason why I kept the Cup of Muscle on the Zergling, otherwise I would have probably gone for trying to get a spawning pool. I end up just playing down the Cup of Muscle onto my Zergling and just pass over to them. Ultimately, I am just trying to get a decent sized minion to be able to deal with their potential threats, and obviously have some sort of aggression going into their turns that they have. So I end up drawing the Nidus Worm, which is quite strong. With the Nidus Worm, it means that I'll be able to have a play next turn, and I hopefully will be able to draw into my spawning pool to get some more Zerglings onto the board. Obviously, having the pressure of 2/5/3s is quite a lot for a warrior, especially since their minions that they get from liftoff and things like that won't be able to deal with them. So I use the Nidus Worm here. It gets me a Kerrigan, and it also gets me an Evolution Chamber, which is fine. I just send both of my minions face because they're going to be the ones that will have to trade ultimately anyway. There's no point trading into the 2/1 here. They end up just using New Heights, which does mean that they're not actually establishing very much going into this next turn, which is quite good for me. I do obviously have the Hounds as well, which is decent. And I also obviously have the Weapon as well, which can have some specific aggression towards them too. There are obviously a few different options that I can go about for this turn in particular, like because with the celestial shot plus the buff, it does put my opponent down to quite a low health total, and I do obviously have the sharpshooter in my hand, which means that I'll be able to deal 6 damage using that as well. Obviously, this quite strong aggression is quite difficult for the opponent to be able to deal with as well. So they end up just launching their starship, and they do the concussive shells. It does put them down to 5 health, and obviously with my sharpshooter, it means that I can deal the 2 damage, then the extra 4 with my celestial shot that was added there, and ultimately it ends up being lethal. So as you can see, there is quite a lot of early game aggression that can come from this deck. It does, fall off later in later turns, but if you're able to get quite a strong start, you're able to deal quite a lot with the opponent that's here too. Going into Druid, it's going to be quite a strong matchup for me, pretty much no matter what, as long as I get minions that are above 2/2s, above 1 health, so 2 health or more, because ultimately it will mean that they won't be able to trade into it very effectively, especially since they use Swipe to clear those particular things, and that not many of them are running a spell damage package to be able to deal with bigger health minions. So I play down the spawning pool turn 1, which is going to be your best play. Ultimately, it's your highest win rate card. Once you have the spawning pool down, you want to make sure that you are not trying to look for any other minions. So you'll notice that this next turn that I won't use my tracking or anything like that. I'll just be using Cup of Muscle and more than likely just playing the minion down. It does mean that you obviously can apply pressure to your opponent, and then with the evolution chambers, you're able to give the extra buffs for your opponent. I do end up drawing into a second Zergling, which is fine. Obviously, it means that I can set up for next turn what I need to, and then having the 2/3/2s down on the board is quite strong for me too. Next turn, it's important that I don't proc the spawning pool before using my reserve spots, just because obviously I want to get the extra buff going onto my my Zerglings, and then I want to reduce down its cost as well. So they at the moment only have the 1/1 that's down on the board. Obviously, it's not a very strong minion for them to have as well. So it means that I'm sitting in a relatively strong position. So most of the damage that you use with this deck is going to be directed towards the opponent's face. It's not very often that you'll be wanting to trade. Only in the turns that you have rush, you might do some trading. But most of the time, the damage that you end up accumulating is going to go towards your opponent's face. So I end up drawing the reserve spot here. I play it down onto my Zergling, and then I pop the spawning pool, just because I do want to end up trading with these 5/5s into their minions. It obviously means that I get a more aggressive board state, while also making sure they're not going to be able to take up my other Zerglings. Next turn I do have the Cup of Muscle plus Zergling plus Evolution Chamber play, which is going to be quite strong for quite a lot for my opponent to be dealing with, especially since they, if they use a swipe or something like that, it means it's only just clearing one of the minions on the board, and then they potentially be wanting to set up for the next turn to do a swipe as well, but they won't be able to since I do have the Evolution Chamber. So they end up using the Malfurion's Gift, and it does get them a wild growth, so I am currently posing quite a lot of damage on board with the 16 damage that's there on board. They use the coin here, which is perfectly fine, there's not too much to worry about, and then Living Roots. Obviously this means that they're reducing down the damage a little bit, but I'm still dealing 13 damage on board at the moment. I do end up drawing into the Birdwatching, which I don't really need to use at the moment, so I just use the Cup of Muscle to apply more pressure towards my opponent, and then my Evolution Chamber, obviously, to get more pressure onto the opponent as well. This means that I'm not really needing to worry about playing around Mind Control tech, because obviously it's a 5 cost card, and it doesn't do anything for them in this situation. They play down their Lotus Blossom, which is perfectly fine, because I am posing a lot of damage on board. There's not actually any particular way I think that Druid can survive this sort of damage burst that's here. So I end up just drawing my last card, and then they end up conceding against me. Obviously, with the aggression that I had there, there's not too much that the Druids are going to be able to do against that. Going to this next game, I am playing against another Druid. So this Druid, once again, is going to be the Dungar Druid or Hero Power Druid. Quite often, you just need to assume that you're playing against Hero Power Druid lately in these higher ranks. Obviously, in other ranks in Legend and also in Diamond and things like that, you might be playing against non-legends, but yeah. In this gameplay, I also wanted to test to see how birdwatching would go, especially since I did have the spawning pool. It would mean that I could buff my Zergling by using the birdwatching in addition to it. So that was a little thought that I had behind it, just to give that extra little buff potentially to my other Zerglings. I end up just using the birdwatching here. Since they are having a pretty slow start, it means that I can get the buff on 3 of my Zerglings to become 3/2s. They play down their Groovy Cat, which is perfectly fine. I do obviously have the spawning pool, and I have the other Zergling buffs in my hand. I do use the spawning pool proc here, which is decent, but I didn't really need to use it. But the idea behind that play is that then I can use the RC Rampage to be able to get buffs onto my minions, especially if they do use something like a swipe into me. By having a wide board of relatively strong minions, it means that they won't have a particularly easy way to deal with me, especially since there isn't there isn't any 2 damage AoEs that Druid have access to. So with this board that's here, they more than likely will just be using a swipe, so that's my thought behind it, because having 3/2s down on the board this wide means that it more than likely will mean that I'll be able to use the RC Rampage for decent value. So they end up using a swipe on one of my 3/2s. Obviously it clears one of the 3/2s and then one of the 1/1. I do have the other 3, the 3 ones here. With that, it's possible they may have another swipe in their hand too, so I end up just playing down the Evolution Chamber with the shot going first. Obviously it poses more damage towards them, but it also means that there isn't a particularly easy way for them to clear my board. They end up using their second swipe, which does show that I was playing correctly around their particular plays. Then they use the coin and the Astral Phaser, so it means that they are clearing 2 of the minions. But with the sharpshooter that I have in my hand, I'm able to just hit with that, and then use the Arcane Shot for the 14 damage for lethal. And that's game that's there. So basically, if you do end up drawing Ranger Gilly, you're in a lot of trouble, which does make the match significantly harder, since you do have you can't use your reserve spot as easy. You don't get the buffs as likely onto your minions and things like that too. I do have a Zergling, so and the reserve spot. That's the reason why I kept the 2 together. It potentially was, like, you'll notice in this gameplay that I end up doing that it's potentially better just playing down the Zergling for tempo against this opponent. So I do just play it down. I do obviously have the Evolution Chambers just in case to be able to deal with my opponent. And it is important that you are establishing as much aggression as you can into the opponent. If I had a spawning pool, it would have been really good for me, but yeah, I end up just doing that just to make sure that I've got some sort of, I'm posing some sort of damage towards the opponent. Next turn I can use the Nidus Worm anyway, which is the reason why previously I ended up playing down those minions first. They end up using their Brood Queen. I don't want to trade into this just because I don't have a particularly strong trade that I'd be able to do. I do end up drawing into another Zergling, which is obviously quite strong, and then another Evolution Chamber. I send both of my 3/2s damage face, and then I end up just passing. There's no point playing down the Zergling just in case they do have a way to AoE clear me. If they had something like Baneling plus Coin, and then some sort of way, some sort of like, you know, chilling, some sort of way to deal the damage with it, so it's no point doing it in that particular way. I do end up drawing into my Ranger Ghillie, which is a little bit annoying, but ultimately I can just use a reserve spot on it to reduce down the cost. I do play down the 3/2s as well, and I send my 5 damage face just because there isn't any particularly easy way that they are able to clear, that they're able to heal back the damage that goes towards their face, and the Viper play at the moment wouldn't really be too much of a concern for me, simply because I do have the Ranger Ghillie with the buff that's on me, so they're not particularly in a strong position to be able to deal with my my minion that's in my hand, since I did just play the reserve spot down onto it. Because the Ranger Ghillie obviously at the moment is quite strong with it being an 8/10. So they end up just playing down the Viper, which is perfectly fine. Obviously, it's not a great situation for them to be in. They do clear my other minions, and then I do still obviously have the Ranger Ghillie here. So it's important that I'm just sending all my damage face in this situation. There's not really any potential threat that can go towards me here. So I end up just playing down the Sharpshooter, go face with my Ranger Ghillie, and then I send the face damage with my with my weapon, and then I just use the Arcane shot towards them. I was considering whether just to put it onto the 2/1, but ultimately they just ended up conceding. Okay, so in this matchup I'm playing against a Hunter, so with the Hunters they could potentially be playing a hand buff Hunter like I am, or it's possible they could be playing something like a Discover Hunter. So my thought process behind it was I wanted to keep the Cup of Muscle just because I am getting the 3 other cards. It is important to keep, you know, your buffs and things like that, but ultimately, if I didn't draw a Zergling or a Spawning Pool, I would be in a bit of trouble here. I did also want to obviously test out to see how that sort of hand would go, just having the Cup of Muscle, which didn't ultimately end up paying off. I'm just end up playing down the Zergling as well, just to apply some pressure onto my opponents since they didn't have a turn 1 play. And by having the 2 3/2s on the board, and I do also have tracking to be able to search for a minion too. They just play down their spawning pool, which is perfectly fine. Like, it only means that they have 2 1/1s come onto the board. I do have the Shimmering Shot to be able to trade into one of the 1/1s. And I end up choosing the RC Rampage just because it's going to be the card that will be strongest going into this matchup, just to be able to deal with my opponent's board, because the fact that there's not too many AoEs that can come from Hunter, it's just Explosive Trap, which you don't particularly need to worry too hard about, or the Carrigan, which isn't able to be played till at the earliest turn 6. They end up playing down their Niall, which is obviously quite strong for them. I do just play down my spawning pool, I play down the buff onto the Zergling, and I'm just opting and thinking about whether to play the Zergling down or not. It could be both choices aren't bad in terms of adding the extra buff or getting the extra damage onto the board. Ultimately, I decided just to use the Cup of Muscle and get the extra minions onto the board, just because with the RC Rampage, it means that I can go wide against them anyway. They obviously do have their spawning pool ready for this turn to be able to deal some damage towards me, but without having the Parrot Sanctuary currently on board, there's not too much of a combo that they'll be able to do to deal with this wide board that I have. They end up just playing down their spawning pool, and they play down the Parrot Sanctuary. Obviously, it does get them the extra 1/1 doing it in this particular way, and then they're able to trade into a few of my minions. I still do have the 3/2s down on my board as well, which is quite strong for me. So I end up just playing down the RC Rampage and then just going face with my other minions because 3/3s on the board is going to be too strong for them to be able to deal with, especially since it's now out of range for Explosive Trap. And next turn I can use Patchwork Powers to be able to deal some more damage towards them as well. They play down their Scout and then they do a tracking, so they're probably looking for an alien encounters, but with 3/3s on the board it means that I can deal with the alien encounters relatively easily. And then they end up just conceding. So yeah, like it is obviously quite aggressive to be able to go with into your opponent with this. So playing against a rogue, it's pretty important, the similar sort of strategy. So even if you're playing against weapon rogue, you are wanting to go mostly face. Obviously, I trade away the Ranger Gilly and all these other cards because it's important that I am getting the aggressive pace onto my opponent. I do have a bird watching in my hand, and unfortunately I do end up drawing into the Ranger Gilly, but there are obviously ways that you can play around with it as well. I get a relatively decent one drop as well with my Shimmering Shot, which is good for me. Next turn's going to be using the bird watching to be able to get the Zergling out of my deck, and then I can obviously pose a little bit of damage. Because of the fact that they end up drawing the coin that was there, I do make sure that I do recognize that, so it's important that to know that they are more than likely playing Weapon Rogue, because it's not very likely that the Archon Rogue would be able to get two pirates out to get the extra coins through the dig for treasure. They end up just using a coin and then using their hero power to go face, which is perfectly fine. That's not too much of an issue for me. With the bird watching being down on the board, for those minions, I do also play down the Zerglings because it's not very likely they'll be able to use two sets of Fan and Knives onto me, and having this wide of a board with 3/3s is going to be quite strong into the opponent. They end up using their own manager with a prep, so it does mean they can get a coin and then they can use a Valera's Gift for a backstab, but obviously it's still not dealing with the board that I have here. So once again, it's important here that I'm just sending most of my damage face towards them. I end up drawing an RC Rampage, which is really good for me in this situation too, because having 2/2s is going to be really strong into the opponent, since there's not any way now that they've used their their Valera's Gift to be able to clear my board, and having the 2/2s means that I can go quite aggressive into the opponent. And I am currently obviously dealing 11 damage on board, so they end up just playing down their backstab. I do draw into a Char, but that's not going to be any use for me in this game. So I send my my weapon to face and I deal the 2 damage, and I just send the rest of the damage face to the opponent because there's not any healing cards inside Weapon Rogue besides from like the stick up cards, and that's obviously not going to be very consistent. The only thing that could threaten me in this situation is going to be the stick up to clear with Heat Wave or healing, but both of those particular strategies don't work, considering if they use Heat Wave, I can just use the weapon proc plus arcane plus hero power, and the other way would just be, obviously I have a wide board that I'd just be able to deal with them anyway. Okay, so going into this game against Shaman, it is one of the more difficult matchups, especially since they can get early game minions onto the board that are in general stickier than your minions. I do draw into a spawning pool and reserve spot, which is going to be a quite good start for me. Obviously, turn 1's going to be playing down the spawning pool against the opponent. There's not really any other play that you'd do. So I play down the spawning pool, activate it, and then just pass over to the opponent. Next turn is always going to be using coin reserve spot in this situation, because obviously it does threaten your opponent with the minions that are there for it. I draw into a Shimmer Shot, so it's not really anything that I need to worry about for it. It's not really going to do anything for me at the moment. And I just use a reserve spot and get out my 2 Zerglings as 5/5s. Next turn I can use something like this spawning pool proc plus bird watching to get bigger minions. And then obviously I can get the rush minions to be able to deal with my opponent's board that they're going to end up having. They play down the Liftoff, and it does get them a medvac, which is fine. There's not really anything too worrying about that. So first I use the spawning pool, I then use the bird watching to be able to get another set of Zerglings, and I play down the 3/2 here. I use it to trade into the 2/2, and then I trade with my 7/6 into the medvac, just because it's possible they could use the backstage bouncer, and I needed to play around that just in case that they did play a backstage bouncer, because medevac's not very useful in general, and backstage bouncer obviously could be a lose condition in this situation. So there's not really anything like Thrall's Gift obviously clears 2 of the minions, but it doesn't clear all the minions that are on the board. So it means that I'm still sitting in a relatively decent situation going into next turn. I play down the RC Rampage just because it's not likely that they'd have another clear. I don't think they're going to have another Thrall's Gift since they did just use one. And obviously the other play around would be 2 missile pods, but ultimately it's not very likely they're going to be able to deal that sort of damage to this. It's not likely that I have that combo of cards, and they just end up conceding. So if you've enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe, and bye for now.